One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. Today's going to be a companion episode to the last episode I did on laboratory tests that I wouldn't spend my own money on. And this is going to be the other side of the coin. This is going to be a discussion about lab tests that I would spend my own money on, or I would ask my family or certainly my clients, because I think that they're applicable in a broad range of situations and contexts. Now, having said that, there's a whole host of labs that are around. For example, 15 years ago, we didn't have as many lab options as we do today. And as functional medicine has grown in popularity among healthcare consumers, and as more and more healthcare practitioners are learning to use functional medicine with their clients, more and more labs have sprung up, allowing us to test for things that we couldn't even think of, even 5 years ago in some cases. And some of it is very sophisticated, but not all of it is relevant to each individual. And so today, again, we're talking about the other side of the coin, tests that I would spend my own money on. And these are tests that I quite frequently order in my own practice with my one-on-one coaching clients. And understand that this is my list. Other practitioners might value tests that I don't, maybe because they serve a different type of client base, maybe because they have different education or training or experience than I do, and all of that is okay. So my list of things that I would spend my money on is geared to speak to an average healthcare consumer who has the most common health complaints that we see in the functional medicine space. And real quickly, that might be some combination of, say, fatigue, brain fog, gut issues, sleep issues, thyroid problems, and so on. And we could keep adding to the list. But to be clear, each of these complaints has many potential causes. And so if we're truly concerned about finding and fixing root cause, which is the core of functional medicine, we have to run enough tests to find the data that we need to guide the choices that we make without simply testing for the sake of testing. And so, like with most of us in my line of work, at least those of us who are more science-minded, we tend to have a motto which goes like this: test, don't guess. Now, but there's always a fine line between doing the right type and the right amount of testing and going just a little bit overboard. Because there's a point at which you order more testing and you get more information, but it's not necessarily going to change what you do. But to be honest, there are some cases where there's nothing wrong with doing more testing, even if it doesn't change what we're going to do. And the main reason for that might be, for example, to settle someone's mind and their emotions over things that they are concerned about. For example, I might order, say, a brain MRI or an abdominal CT scan for someone, not because I think we're going to find something really bad, but because doing so will ease their fears and then let us focus on what we do know instead of focusing on the fear of what we don't know. On top of that, sometimes we want to get baseline testing so that we have something to compare future testing to. Again, as an example, I usually encourage my thyroid clients to get baseline diagnostic ultrasounds if they've not had that done. And this is imaging of their thyroid gland. Now, most of them are negative or have very mild findings, but since we know that the underlying root cause of hypothyroidism is Hashimoto's autoimmunity, we expect that there are going to be changes in the thyroid gland over a period of time. And so having a baseline normal test or even some mild findings helps us understand what a future more serious finding means to that progression over time. So if I order a diagnostic ultrasound for someone who has never had their thyroid imaged and it shows some ugly stuff, but there's no baseline for comparison. We don't know how much has changed or how quickly. Whereas if we could compare a new diagnostic ultrasound with some ugly things to a diagnostic ultrasound that was done 2 years ago, and we can see the interval changes, now we have a better understanding of how aggressive their autoimmune reactivity has become and how it's changing the morphology and usually the function of the gland. Now, this particular episode is not about, thyroid and MRIs and diagnostic ultrasounds. We're going to be talking more about laboratory diagnostic tests rather than imaging. But honestly, there are many different reasons to order lab tests or even imaging studies. Again, to have baseline comparisons for things that we know are likely to change over time. Also to allay fears so we can focus on what we do know and what we don't know, or rather than what we don't know. But first and foremost, we order lab tests to get clarity on underlying mechanisms and root causes, which we use then to drive our functional medicine recommendations, typically in the domains of diet, lifestyle, and nutritional supplementation. So let's talk about diagnostic testing, or think about diagnostic testing this way. There are a handful of tests that I feel pretty much everybody needs. And that's based on the perspective that we all share fundamental systems and functions that are involved in all chronic diseases and complaints. And there are a set of common complaints that have a set of common causes. But while these are the commonalities that I see from time to time in client, or not from time to time, but from client to client, we also have to recognize that each person is an individual and may need some testing that others don't, testing that goes beyond the general tests that I feel most people can benefit from. And so we can divide this discussion into what we might call Tier 1 and Tier 2 testing. Tier 1 are the tests that are going to be most revealing for most people in most circumstances, and therefore they are the ones that we tend to order most commonly. Tier 2 would be the tests that provide more clarity that will be relevant to some people in some circumstances, but not to everybody. And we could even factor in, say, a Tier 3 test or testing, which are the things that we might want to do later based on what we might find in both Tiers 1 and Tier 2. Or as we see how someone progresses through a functional medicine program over time. And so Tier 3 would be like an if-then approach. Like if we see this or this happens, then we'll do this test. And if it doesn't happen, then we don't. And what that does is it gives us flexibility to do or not do certain things based on how someone is responding to the changes they're making in their life and their lifestyle. So let me give you my list of Tier 1 tests first, and then we're going to break this down, and I'm probably going to end up spending one episode per test. So yeah, in the last episode when I said this was a one-off, well, what I just did, this has now become a mini series. So surprise, surprise. All right, so here's my list of the most useful tests that I would spend my own money on if I was in the position of having chronic health issues that I needed to figure out, and I needed some objective data. Number one, a good set of blood labs. And I mean a good set. Come back to that. Number two, a saliva test to check stress chemistry and circadian rhythms. And number three, a well-designed stool test to look for pathogens, dysbiotic overgrowth, and to get some handle on the microbiome. That would be my Tier 1 set of tests. Now, Tier 2 testing is all context and client specific. Very common Tier 2 test would be things like leaky gut, food sensitivities, environmental toxins, chronic infection panels, looking for things like chronic Epstein-Barr or other critters that tend to hang out in the body and then turn off and turn on periodically. And finally, a relatively new test called the lymphocyte map from one of my favorite labs called Cyrex Labs, which gives us a detailed breakdown of the subsets of the immune system. Now, I place a lot of value on that because I tend to work with people who have complex immune-related problems. A lot of them, most of them, have either one or more autoimmunities. Somebody else who doesn't do the kind of work I do might not place any value on that. It might not give them any information that's useful to them simply because they serve a different client base and they do different things. And then tier 3 would become anything else that would be relevant at some point in any given person's future. So tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. All right, let's talk about tier 1, which is starting with a good set of blood labs. And I say good set, and I say it that way for good reasons. And that is, like, conventional doctors order more blood tests, or they order blood tests more frequently than any other type of practitioner, for the most part. There's always going to be exceptions when I make statements like that. So conventional docs order blood tests more frequently than pretty much anyone else, but they usually don't run comprehensive testing. And here's where the problem is. And the reason for that is twofold. First and foremost is because docs that are in the conventional system have to follow rules that I don't. MDs are pretty much told which tests that they can run under what circumstances by two different groups or two different entities. The first is, say, they're governing medical associations, especially if they're specialists who have published sets of labs that are relevant to their specialty. And in that system, they really don't like their doctors to color outside of the lines or to stray from their lane, so to speak. But second, and perhaps this is the most relevant one, is that in the conventional system, which is an insurance-based model, the insurance companies that are paying for your tests dictate what tests can be run when, and you can't run certain tests unless you do other tests first to see if there's really a problem. And so they limit the amount of diagnostics in many cases, still always exceptions, but in most cases, insurance companies dictate what docs can run or what will get reimbursed. Doctors can order whatever they want, but the general expectation is in the conventional world that if the doctor wants to run certain tests, then they want them to be reimbursed by the insurance company. But even more than that, most medical doctors these days are specialists who care only about their specialty and little else. And that specialization really started back somewhere around the 1980s when insurance reimbursement became common and insurance companies started paying specialists more money than general practitioners. And successive generations of medical students decided, well, I'm going to become a specialist because I can make more money. And that actually has had a huge impact on what I call or consider to be the fracturing of the conventional medical system. And so the endocrinologist doesn't care all that much about your blood sugar unless they're dealing specifically with people who are, say, diabetics. The gastro doesn't care much about your thyroid, and so on and so on. And again, what's happened over the last 4 decades or so is this fracturing of conventional medicine almost to an almost endless series of specialties where docs get very good at looking at one small part of human function, but very bad at thinking about anything else. Now, there's good and there's bad in that. For example, this past year, I had major shoulder surgery for some torn muscles and torn cartilage associated with, fitness and activity. Now, believe me when I say, when I went to see an orthopedist about my shoulder, and I wanted him to focus on anything or focus. Let me back up. I wanted my ortho to focus on nothing but my shoulder. I needed him to be a specialist. I didn't really need him to be asking, say, about my thyroid or about my brain or about anything else. I had torn muscles and cartilage, and I needed him to fix it, which he did, and I'm very thankful. But most people who go to medical doctors these days have multiple symptoms in multiple systems. They don't have one complaint like I did. They have maybe a half dozen or more. And a lot of times when people have multiple symptoms in multiple systems, they have links or root causes that are linked to choices that they've made over long periods of time related to diet, lifestyle, and how they interact with their environment. And a lot of these things are preventable and correctable by making changes to diet, lifestyle, and environmental reactivity. But because the medical system has become so specialized, the chances that you're going to see a general practitioner who actually, or a specialist for certain, who sees you as a whole person, who understands that all your physiological systems are interconnected, and who tries to connect the dots of your root cause, that probability is very low. And it's just the system. It's not because they're bad people. It's not because they're not intelligent. It's how they've been trained, and it's how they see the world. Now, you also have renegade MDs, and I use that word kindly. Actually, I use that as a compliment. You get these renegade MDs who think outside the box, and they do very good work. But for the most part, if you go to a conventional general practitioner or an internist with a multitude of complaints, multiple symptoms, and multiple systems, you're going to get a multitude of prescriptions and or referrals to specialists who handle those individual complaints. And so you see your GP, your internist, you see the gastro for your gut problems, and you see a rheumatologist for your joint and your muscle pains, and on and on and on. And listen, even in my own meager practice experience of going on 30 plus years now, I've worked with one-on-one coaching clients who have come to me on well over a dozen medications being prescribed by a team of 8 to 10 different specialists. And you know that old saying, too many cooks in the kitchen. And that's a huge clue that something is being missed when you see somebody working with so many doctors and being on so many different medications. And just as an aside, it's difficult enough to predict for an individual person how a couple of different medications might interact with each other in that person's body, let alone someone who's on 15, 16, 18 different drugs. It becomes very untenable and unmanageable. Now, every once in a while, a new client of mine will ask if I can give them a list of labs that I want to see, that they'll take to their medical doctor and see if their MD will order it for them, just so their insurance will pay for it. Now, I warn them that this almost never works out, but they usually insist. And so I play along until it becomes evident that it's not going to work out. And often when this happens, when I get labs back that are ordered by their MD, it's almost cut way down, sometimes in half or less of what I'm actually requesting. So we would want to wonder why or understand why. And first of all, it's like, what doctor wants to order labs for someone else that they don't know, right? Let alone a chiropractor. And that's quite often what I hear. Like, some people have reported to me that that's exactly what their MD said to them. Like, who is this guy and what does he know? He's a chiropractor. Well, that's a different discussion. But perhaps more to the point, even though they have my wish list, they still have to abide by their insurance company's rules. Just because I'm asking for it doesn't mean it changes how the system works. And that, unfortunately, is the sad reality. So what we end up doing is taking what the MD has ordered and taking that and just ordering more labs to get everything that we want. We may as well just started with what I wanted to begin with, but it is what it is. So the question is this: if our goal in thinking and talking about, say, tier 1 testing, if our goal is to use blood labs to assess a wide range of fundamental physiological systems, which is what blood labs are really good at, the question is, how much is enough? What do you test? So let's go through this without turning this into a 3-day mastering blood chemistry seminar that I teach to other doctors throughout the year. And I think what I'm going to do, in fact, I've already done this, is put a list together for you that lays it out just on a single sheet. And this will simply be a list of labs that I routinely order as my initial workup on pretty much all of my one-on-one coaching clients. And I will put the link in the episode description, so you can go straight to a page on my website, put in your email address, and you'll be able to download that. In fact, why don't you pause it right now and just check the link in the list and go do that, and then come back, and then we can continue on. Now, if I was to sit here and talk through each individual test, what it measures, why we order it, what does it mean if it's too high? What if it means if it's too low? What does it mean if it's combined with other patterns and different lab markers? then yes, indeed, we would be here for 3 days, right? So obviously we can't do that. Instead, it's probably more useful to talk about a set of functional priorities, what is important to assess upfront with blood work, and then let the list that you can download speak for itself. Now, having said that, understand that while blood labs are really good at assessing these fundamental systems, they're pretty bad at assessing other things. For example, there's only so much information that you can get from blood lab testing about, say, gut function. And this is why we need other things like perhaps DNA-based stool testing or microbiome testing or even saliva or serum blood testing for things like leaky gut. The standard blood testing just does not do a good job, and we have to go other places and use other sources to round out that information. And again, I'll put the link to the PDF in the description below. Pause the podcast, just go download that, and then come back. All right, so this is a consumer version, healthcare consumer version of a clinical model that I use in my own practice, that I've taught to literally thousands of other practitioners from around the world over the last 15 years. And it hasn't changed all that much because it's based on human function, which does not change. It's based on an understanding of a hierarchy of physical systems, meaning that no matter the person or the complaint, we need to know the status of these most fundamental systems because all other functions are predicated or based on them. So, at a baseline, when we do initial evaluations, and we want to see as much of the big picture as possible, here's what we need to address or assess. Number one, let's call it substrate delivery. What is substrate? Substrate is something, it's raw material that you use for something else. For example, substrate could be glucose, blood sugar, which you use to make energy. And there's many other examples. But I'll tell you one thing, that especially when it comes to chronic health issues, we have a saying in my world and in my circle, not just test, don't guess, but we have a saying that basically says blood flow is king. And what that means is that if you don't have good blood flow and you can't deliver things like nutrients, hormones, immune cells, enzymes, whatever, to your cells, and if you can't take away debris and garbage for elimination, then that's a big problem. And so in order to assess substrate delivery, we need to think about things like blood flow or even blood pressure, which obviously we don't measure with a blood test. That's something that you can measure at home with something you get off Amazon. Just, spend $20 and get a blood pressure monitor and check to see if it's too high or if it's too low. But really, substrate delivery is all about blood flow, blood pressure, and cellular hydration, which again tells us, can we get things we want to the cells that need them? And can we take away the junk from normal physiology that tends to accumulate if we can't flow from the cells to the liver to detoxify and to get rid of the junk? So that's number one, substrate delivery. Number two is energy metabolism. And this is a fairly complicated section, but basically this is about having adequate red blood cells, having enough hemoglobin, having enough iron, having a spectrum of B vitamins, as well as good control over things like fasting blood sugar or daytime blood sugar, as well as your insulin levels. And again, that's a mini series just in and of itself, but energy metabolism, we're assessing that is pretty critical. We also want to know, and this is number three, we want to know about kidney function. We want to make sure that they're participating effectively and efficiently in filtering out toxins. We also want to know about electrolyte balance, which relates both to kidneys as well as hormones produced by the adrenal glands. We want, and this is number five, we want to look at the lipid panel, which is not just about your total cholesterol. There's I'll probably end up doing a series on this, but there's a lot of mythology around high cholesterol and what that means. But more importantly than just looking at your total cholesterol is to look at key cardiovascular risk ratios, calculated, for example, and this is the most important one, at least in my opinion, not just mine, but a bunch of other people, your triglyceride to HDL ratio. It tells us a lot more than just looking at your total cholesterol by itself. We also want to look at inflammatory markers. And there are the standard inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein or what's called the sedimentation rate. These are the standard ones that your MD might run to see if someone's inflamed. But to be honest, there's a host of other what are called acute phase reactants that either can go up or go down when you're inflamed that can indicate inflammation when these typical tests your MD will run are normal. And here's an example. I might have somebody come to me as a new client, and I might suggest to them after listening to the story and in some cases observing them, moaning and groaning as they get up and down out of a chair, for example, or they're telling me about all the joint pain and the brain fog and the fatigue they have. And I might say, it sounds like you're inflamed. We just got to figure out where it's coming from. And quite often someone will say, well, my doctor checked me for that, and he says or she says I'm not inflamed. Well, invariably, they just check the standard test. But there are many other tests that people can express inflammation through, but the normal testing is normal. And I'm using air quotes around the word normal. We also want to know about immune status. We want to look at your white blood cell count, as well as what we call the differential, the different types of white blood cells that can show us acute or chronic infections or immune depletion and suppression, and may give us some clues that will allow us to differentiate if someone's immune challenge is bacterial, or if it's viral or fungal or parasitic, or, as is commonly the case, a combination of those things. We want to look at thyroid balance. And when I say that, I mean a full panel, not just like the classic TSH or TSH and T4 that a GP or an endocrinologist will run. We need to look for markers of autoimmunity. We need to look at a spectrum of thyroid tests, about 9 in total, that will tell us about errors in production, errors in processing, and errors in proteomics. And if this is the first time you're hearing about those things, you might want to go back and listen to some of the podcasts that I've done about the whole thyroid system, or better yet, go to my website and check out the courses that I offer, including the 4-pillar thyroid system, which is an amazing set of information. I'm telling you, this is cutting edge stuff that I'm teaching doctors in the seminars that I run, but it's a healthcare consumer version of that. So thyroid balance. And finally, we have to look at things like reproductive hormones to look for patterns of primary or secondary hypogonadism, to look at hormone conversion issues, whether or not there's changes in free fraction hormones, and more. And that is a fair and very accurate hierarchical way to look at fundamental systems. And I'm telling you that good comprehensive blood work is the best way to look at so many different things. And doing a thorough evaluation of your fundamental physiology can't be done just with a CBC and a metabolic panel and a TSH and a T4, which is typically what you're going to get in conventional medicine. And now you know why, because there are limitations to how they can prescribe testing, for example. Bottom line is that if you look at a requisition, the shorter your lab list is, the fewer things you're testing, which means the more things you can't see. And this doesn't mean that follow-up testing has to be that comprehensive, but when you're doing an initial evaluation, especially if someone is expecting me, for example, to turn over rocks and look in places that nobody else has, to find answers and solutions that nobody else has offered, then I know that I need to cast my diagnostic net very widely. And if I don't do that, then I'm cheating myself as a clinician and a guide, and I'm cheating the person that I'm trying to help. Now, there's so much more that can be said. Like I said, I teach a 2-day version and a 3-day version of blood chemistry analysis to licensed practitioners. And I've done that for 15 years or so. This information doesn't change because human function and physiology does not change. Now, obviously, our understanding of it might, but I hope you find this clarifying in terms of why there are so many people out there who suffer from chronic health issues that they keep hearing that everything is normal. Part of the problem is that they don't look at optimal ranges versus lab ranges. That's a different discussion that maybe we'll fold in our next episode. But most importantly, when you go into the conventional healthcare system, you're typically not going to get a comprehensive enough assessment of your fundamental physiological hierarchy. And it's quite easy to miss problems that are so fundamental that doing other things are not going to be effective, at least not the way that you want them to. So just a reminder before we sign off, use the link that's in the description, hop over to the website, download that free guide. It's just a single page. It's a graphic that's got these hierarchies or these hierarchical systems listed out, as well as the most common tests that I would order to assess those things, and a couple of other comments just for clarity. I hope you enjoy it. I think it will bring value to you. At least it will give you an idea of what a good comprehensive assessment of your health and your wellness looks like. Next time we come back, we'll make some closing remarks and kind of sew up a couple of loose ends in dealing with lab tests, blood labs, and we'll dive into talking about saliva testing and, is it accurate? Should we be doing it? And what does it mean to assess your stress chemistry or your circadian rhythms? And why might you want to consider that? Thanks for being here. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.